Flight 428 from Nashville to Seattle was running exactly on schedule when Aaron boarded that crisp October morning. The Boeing 757 was about three-quarters full. A typical midweek crowd of business travelers, families, and a few tourists heading to the Pacific Northwest. Aaron found his seat in 14B and settled in, pulling out his tablet to catch up on work emails. The atmosphere was unremarkable, routine, just another commercial flight among the thousands that crisscross America every day. But in 90 minutes, Captain Richard Hayes would make an announcement that would transform this ordinary flight into something none of these passengers would ever forget. Captain Hayes sat in the cockpit completing his pre-flight checks alongside First Officer Jennifer Park. At 58 years old, Richard had been flying commercial aircraft for 33 years. He'd logged over 22,000 flight hours, transported millions of passengers safely, and had an impeccable safety record. Jennifer, at 31, had been his co-pilot for the past 6 months, and had tremendous respect for his professionalism and calm demeanor. "Weather looks perfect all the way to Seattle," Jennifer reported, scanning the radar. Richard nodded, his mind already running through the flight plan. The fuel calculations, the winds aloft, everything by the book as always. What neither Aaron nor any of the other passengers knew was that this was Captain Richard Hayes' final flight, not his final flight before a vacation or before transferring to another route, his final flight ever. Yesterday, he'd received the phone call from his doctor that he'd been dreading for months. The cancer that he'd been fighting privately for 2 years had progressed. Aggressive treatment had failed. The FAA medical examiner had revoked his medical certificate that morning. After today, Richard Hayes would never again sit in a captain's chair, never again feel the power of takeoff, never again guide passengers safely through the skies. This was his goodbye to the only career he'd ever loved. Flight attendant Patricia Coleman had worked with Captain Hayes dozens of times over the years. At 46, she'd been flying for 21 years and considered Richard a friend as well as a colleague. Before boarding, Richard had pulled her aside in the crew lounge. "Patricia, I need to tell you something." His voice had been steady, but his eyes carried an ocean of emotion. He'd told her about his condition, about the medical certificate, about this being his last flight. Patricia had fought back tears. "Does the crew know?" Richard shook his head. "Just you, and I'm going to tell the passengers. Near the end of the flight, I need them to know what this means to me." The plane pushed back from the gate right on time. Richard's hands moved through the familiar choreography of switches and buttons, a dance he'd performed thousands of times but would perform only once more. The engines spooled up, and the aircraft began taxiing toward the runway. Over the intercom, his voice came through with its usual calm professionalism. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Hayes from the flight deck. We've been cleared for takeoff, and we're expecting a smooth flight to Seattle with an on-time arrival. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the journey." Aaron barely registered the announcement, already absorbed in his emails. Around him, other passengers read books, worked on laptops, entertained children, or slept. No one had any reason to think this flight would be different from any other. The plane accelerated down the runway, and Richard pulled back on the yoke with practiced precision. The nose lifted, the ground fell away, and Nashville disappeared beneath them as they climbed into clear blue sky. For Richard, every sensation was bittersweet. The vibration through the controls, the angle of ascent, the transition from ground to sky, all of it for the last time. The flight progressed normally for the first hour. Beverage service completed. Passengers settled into their activities. Aaron finished his emails and started watching a movie. A young mother, 3 rows up, successfully got her toddler to nap. An elderly couple near the back held hands and looked out at the clouds below. Ordinary moments on an ordinary flight. But in the cockpit, Richard was memorizing everything. The way sunlight hit the instrument panel, the feel of the throttle under his hand, Jennifer's efficient movements as she monitored systems and communications. Every detail, because soon it would all be memory. But wait, here's what started to change things. About 90 minutes into the flight, cruising smoothly at 38,000 feet over Montana, Richard unfastened his seatbelt and stood. Jennifer looked at him questioningly. "I need to make an announcement," he said quietly. "The one I told you about." Jennifer's eyes widened slightly, then filled with understanding and sadness. She nodded. Richard picked up the intercom handset, then paused. He'd rehearsed what he wanted to say 100 times in his mind, but now, facing the actual moment, his throat tightened. He took a deep breath. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Hayes again." His voice carried the same professional tone as before, but there was something underneath it now, a weight, an emotion that made passengers look up from their activities. Aaron paused his movie, sensing something unusual. "I want to take a moment of your time to share something personal. For those of you who don't know me, I've been a commercial pilot for 33 years. I've flown millions of miles and had the privilege of safely transporting passengers like yourselves to destinations all around this country and the world." The cabin had gone quiet. Passengers exchanged glances. This wasn't a typical in-flight announcement. Patricia stood in the galley, tears already forming in her eyes, even though she'd known this was coming. Richard continued, his voice starting to crack slightly. "This profession has been my life's calling. From the time I was a boy watching planes take off from a small airport near my hometown, I knew this was what I was meant to do. Every single flight has been a gift. Every takeoff, every landing, every moment in the sky has filled me with gratitude and wonder that never faded, no matter how many times I experienced it." Aaron felt his chest tighten. Something significant was happening. Around him, other passengers were putting down phones and books, giving their full attention to the captain's words. Richard paused, gathering himself, then continued, "What you don't know is that for the past 2 years I've been fighting cancer. I kept flying because this job is who I am, and as long as I could safely perform my duties, I wasn't ready to stop. But yesterday, I received news that my medical condition has progressed to a point where I can no longer maintain my medical certification." Gasps rippled through the cabin. A woman 2 rows ahead of Aaron put her hand over her mouth. The elderly man near the back closed his eyes, his wife gripping his hand tighter. Richard's voice was openly emotional now, though still controlled. "What that means is that this flight, Flight 428 from Nashville to Seattle, is my final flight as a commercial pilot. After we land in Seattle today, I will never again have the honor of serving as your captain. I will never again experience the miracle of flight from this seat. This is my last journey, and I wanted you all to know what an incredible privilege it has been to share it with you. Now here's where it became overwhelming." Richard's voice broke completely for a moment. He paused, and passengers could hear him taking a shaky breath over the intercom. When he spoke again, tears were evident in his voice. "I've transported business travelers to important meetings, families to reunions, people to funerals and weddings, and new beginnings. I've carried honeymooners, and soldiers, and students. Each of you has a destination, a reason for your journey, a life waiting for you when you land. Being the person trusted with getting you there safely has been the greatest honor of my life." Aaron felt tears running down his own face. He wasn't alone. Throughout the cabin, passengers were crying openly. The young mother who'd just gotten her toddler to sleep was wiping her eyes. The businessman across the aisle had his head down, shoulders shaking. The elderly couple was holding each other. Patricia in the galley was openly sobbing, along with the other flight attendants. Even Jennifer in the cockpit had tears streaming down her face as she listened to her captain's farewell. Richard continued, his voice raw with emotion. "I want to thank every single one of you for being part of my final flight. I want to thank my incredible crew, who have been like family to me over the years. I want to thank this airline for giving me the opportunity to do what I love for over 3 decades. And I want to thank my wife Sarah, who's listening to this back home, for supporting me through every difficult decision, every long absence, every moment of this journey. Baby, I'm coming home to you, and we're gonna start our next adventure together. You won't believe what happened next." Richard's voice steadied as he approached his conclusion. "Flying has taught me many things, but perhaps the most important is this: we're all passengers on a journey we don't fully control. We don't know how long the flight will last or what turbulence we'll encounter, but we can choose to face it with grace, to find meaning in the journey, to appreciate every moment in the air. Thank you for letting me be your captain one final time. We'll be beginning our descent into Seattle shortly. It's been my absolute privilege." The intercom clicked off. The silence in the cabin lasted only a moment before something extraordinary happened. It started with one person, the elderly man near the back. He began to clap, slowly, deliberately. Then his wife joined him. Then the woman across from Aaron. Then Aaron himself. Within seconds, the entire cabin erupted in applause. Passengers were clapping through their tears, some standing, all of them honoring this man they'd never met but who just shared his heart with them so completely. The applause continued for over a minute, this outpouring of respect and love from strangers for a captain who'd given his life to keeping them safe. Patricia picked up the intercom in the galley. "Captain Hayes," her voice was thick with emotion, "on behalf of every passenger on this aircraft and every crew member you've ever flown with, thank you. Thank you for your service, your dedication, your professionalism, and for showing us what it means to love your calling. We are honored to be on your final flight." In the cockpit, Richard sat with tears streaming down his face, listening to the applause filtering through the door. Jennifer reached over and squeezed his shoulder. "That was beautiful, Captain. You've touched every single person on this plane." Richard nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Finally, he wiped his eyes and took a deep breath. "Okay," he said, his voice still shaky. "Let's get these good people to Seattle. One last landing. Let's make it a perfect one." Aaron sat back in his seat, emotionally overwhelmed. He'd boarded this flight thinking about work deadlines and meeting schedules. Now all of that seemed trivial. This captain, this stranger, had just reminded him what really mattered: passion for your calling, gratitude for the opportunities you're given, grace in the face of loss, finding meaning in every moment. Aaron pulled out his phone and texted his wife, "I love you. I'll explain when I land, but I just witnessed something that put everything in perspective." Throughout the cabin, similar scenes played out. The young mother hugged her toddler closer, crying as she thought about all the moments she'd taken for granted. The businessman called his daughter, whom he hadn't spoken to in months after a fight, and left a tearful voicemail apologizing. The elderly couple sat in quiet contemplation, thinking about their own mortality and the precious time they had left together. Captain Hayes' vulnerability had cracked open something in all of them. As the plane began its descent toward Seattle, Richard handled the controls with extra care, savoring every adjustment, every communication with air traffic control, every aspect of this final approach. The weather was perfect, visibility unlimited, conditions ideal for landing. "It's like the universe is giving you a gift," Jennifer said softly. Richard nodded. "One last beautiful day in the sky. I'll take it." He lined up for the approach, the Seattle skyline visible in the distance, Mount Rainier standing majesty in the background. The landing was flawless. Richard touched down so smoothly that passengers barely felt the wheels meet the runway. As the plane decelerated and turned toward the gate, spontaneous applause broke out again. Richard's voice came over the intercom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. On behalf of myself and First Officer Park, thank you for flying with us today, and thank you from the bottom of my heart for being part of my journey. May your own journeys be filled with purpose and joy. It's been an honor to serve as your captain." But this is where the story becomes even more remarkable. As the plane pulled up to the gate, passengers saw something unusual through the windows. Dozens of airline employees lined the jetway and terminal area. Ground crew, gate agents, other pilots and flight attendants, maintenance workers, all standing at attention. As Richard emerged from the cockpit, Patricia handed him his captain's hat. "Walk out there with your head high, Captain. You've earned this." Richard walked down the aisle toward the exit, and passengers stood, applauding him as he passed. Many reached out to shake his hand, to touch his shoulder, to say thank you. The young mother said, "You've inspired me to be better at my calling too." The businessman said, "I'm going to fix things with my daughter because of you." The elderly man simply saluted, and Richard returned it with tears in his eyes. Aaron caught Richard's eye and said, "Thank you for reminding us what grace looks like." Richard nodded, too emotional to speak. When Richard stepped off the plane, the terminal erupted in applause. Pilots stood saluting. Flight attendants held signs, "Thank you, Captain Hayes," and "Fair winds and following seas." His wife Sarah was there, tears streaming down her face, and Richard went straight to her, holding her close as the applause continued. Airport security had set up a water cannon salute outside, 2 fire trucks spraying arcs of water over the plane in traditional tribute. It was a hero's welcome for a man who'd simply done his job with excellence and heart for 33 years. The passengers from Flight 428 stood watching this tribute, many still crying. They'd boarded as strangers with separate destinations and separate lives, but Captain Hayes' announcement had united them in a shared experience of profound humanity. They'd witnessed courage and vulnerability, love and loss, and the dignity of facing an ending with grace. Many exchanged phone numbers and email addresses, wanting to stay connected to this moment, to these people who'd shared it with them. Aaron's story about Flight 428 went viral when he posted it on social media that evening. Within days, it had been shared millions of times. News outlets picked it up. Captain Richard Hayes became an unlikely celebrity, invited to appear on morning shows and news programs, but he declined most interviews, saying simply, "I just wanted to say goodbye to the job I loved. I didn't expect it to resonate with so many people, but I'm grateful if my story reminded anyone to appreciate their calling while they have it." The airline created a scholarship in Richard's name for young people pursuing careers in aviation. Hundreds of thousands of dollars poured in from donations, including from many passengers who'd been on Flight 428. "Captain Hayes showed my daughter that loving your work is possible," one parent wrote with their donation. "He inspired me to stop complaining about my job and start finding purpose in it," wrote another donor. The scholarship would help dozens of aspiring pilots pursue their dreams, extending Richard's legacy into the future. 6 months later, the airline invited all the passengers from Flight 428 to a reunion event in Seattle. Over 100 of them came, traveling from across the country to reconnect and to see Captain Hayes again. Richard attended with Sarah, now in chemotherapy but fighting hard. "I'm not done yet," he told the gathered passengers with a smile. "I've got more journey ahead, different than I expected, but still meaningful." The passengers shared how that flight had changed them, the decisions they'd made, the relationships they'd repaired, the gratitude they'd found. The young mother from the flight, whose name was Jennifer Collins, told the group, "After Captain Hayes' announcement, I quit my corporate job that I hated and started a nonprofit helping single mothers. Life's too short to spend it doing work that doesn't matter. Captain Hayes taught me that." Others shared similar stories. Career changes, reconciled relationships, new appreciation for daily life.
One man said, "I was actually on my way to Seattle to end my life. I'd planned it all out. But hearing Captain Hayes talk about finding meaning even in endings, about choosing grace, it made me reconsider. I got help instead. He literally saved my life without knowing it." Richard listened to these testimonials with tears flowing freely, holding Sarah's hand. "I thought that flight was my ending," he said when it was his turn to speak. "I thought cancer was taking everything from me. But this, all of you, what you've shared, it's shown me that endings can also be beginnings. My time in the cockpit ended, but my impact continues through each of you. That's more than I ever dreamed of. You've given my struggle meaning." Aaron spoke at the reunion too, sharing how Captain Hayes' announcement had inspired his ongoing work, documenting stories of everyday people showing extraordinary courage and grace. "We live in a world that celebrates loud success and dramatic victories," Aaron said. "But Captain Hayes showed us a different kind of power, the power of vulnerability, the power of gratitude, the power of facing loss with dignity, and finding meaning in endings. That's the kind of strength we all need to learn." The reunion became an annual tradition. Each year, more Flight 428 passengers would gather, and each year they'd share updates on how that flight continued to influence their lives. Captain Hayes attended every reunion his health allowed, watching this community that had formed around a single moment of shared humanity. "I gave them my truth," he told Aaron at the third reunion, "and they gave me purpose beyond my career. Fair trade, I'd say." Captain Hayes lost his battle with cancer 4 years after that final flight. But he died knowing that his life had mattered, that his final act as a pilot had touched thousands of lives in ways he'd never imagined. At his funeral, dozens of passengers from Flight 428 attended, along with hundreds of airline colleagues. The eulogy focused not just on his flying career but on that final announcement, that moment of courage when he'd chosen to share his heart with a plane full of strangers. The airline retired his captain number and placed a plaque in the Seattle airport. Captain Richard Hayes, 1965-2024. His final announcement on Flight 428 reminded us that every journey matters, every passenger has a story, and facing endings with grace is its own form of heroism. Clear skies, Captain. Pilots walking past that plaque would often pause, thinking about their own callings, their own mortality, their own opportunities to touch lives through their work. Aaron included Captain Hayes' story in his book as a centerpiece, chapter about finding meaning in endings. Richard Hayes didn't cure cancer or change aviation safety, or invent new technology, Aaron wrote. He simply told the truth about his pain and his gratitude, and in doing so he reminded over 100 people on one flight that life is precious, callings matter, and grace in the face of loss is always possible. That's justice too, not legal justice, but existential justice. The balancing of suffering with meaning, of loss with purpose. Flight 428 continued on its regular Nashville to Seattle route, but it carried a special significance. Flight attendants would sometimes mention Captain Hayes during flights, especially near the anniversary of his final journey. Passengers would ask to hear the story, and crew members would share it, often getting emotional themselves. "He taught us that every flight matters," one longtime flight attendant said. "Every passenger deserves our best. Every journey is sacred because we never know which one will be our last." The scholarship fund in Captain Hayes' name had helped over 50 aspiring pilots by the 5th anniversary of his death. Many of them specifically cited his final announcement as their inspiration to pursue aviation. "I watched the video of passengers talking about Captain Hayes," one scholarship recipient said. "I saw how much his work mattered, how it touched lives beyond just transportation. I want to be that kind of pilot. I want my calling to mean something too." Sarah Hayes, Richard's widow, became a speaker on grief and meaning-making after loss. She'd talk about how her husband had transformed his cancer diagnosis from a tragedy into an opportunity for connection and impact. He could have hidden his illness, retired quietly, disappeared from his career without explanation, she'd tell audiences. Instead, he chose vulnerability. He chose to let people see his pain and his love for his work. That choice multiplied his impact 1,000-fold. "I miss him terribly, but I'm proud of how he faced his ending." 10 years after that final flight, a documentary filmmaker created a short film about Flight 428, interviewing passengers, crew members, and Sarah Hayes. The film won awards at multiple festivals, and was shown in aviation training programs as an example of how pilots touch lives beyond the technical aspects of their job. Captain Hayes exemplified what it means to be a pilot with heart. One aviation instructor said, "We can teach people to fly planes. Captain Hayes taught us to honor the humans we're flying for." Aaron attended the documentary premiere with several other Flight 428 passengers. Watching the story unfold on screen, seeing footage of Captain Hayes, hearing his voice making that announcement again, the emotion emotions came flooding back. Even a decade later, the impact remained. After the screening, Aaron stood with other passengers, and someone said what they were all thinking: "We're the luckiest people in the world. We could have been on any flight that day, but we were on his final flight. We got to witness grace. We got to be changed by it." That's what Aaron learned from Captain Richard Hayes and Flight 428. That sometimes the most powerful moments aren't the dramatic rescues or the headline-making events. Sometimes they're quieter. A captain sharing his heart, strangers crying together, a community forming around shared witness to someone's courage in facing loss. Those moments change lives just as surely as any grand gesture. They remind us we're human, we're connected, we matter to each other. Captain Hayes never got to fly again. Cancer took that from him, but in losing his calling, he'd found a different kind of purpose. In sharing his grief with strangers, he'd given them permission to feel their own emotions more deeply. In facing his ending with grace, he'd shown them how to face their own challenges with dignity. That final announcement, those few minutes of vulnerability at 38,000 feet, had created ripples that spread far beyond one flight, one plane, one day. And somewhere, Aaron believed, Captain Richard Hayes was still flying, not in a cockpit, not guiding a plane through physical skies, but in the lives he'd touched, the people he'd inspired, the meaning he'd created from loss. That's immortality, Aaron thought, not living forever, but mattering so much that your impact outlives you. Captain Hayes had achieved that. Every scholarship recipient who became a pilot, every passenger who changed their life after that flight, every person who heard the story and chose grace over bitterness, they were all testament to one man's courage to be vulnerable when it mattered most. Flight 421 still flies Nashville to Seattle several times a week. Sometimes, on clear days when the flight is smooth and the sky is endless blue, passengers will look up at the cockpit door and think about Captain Hayes. Flight attendants will pause in the galley and remember his final announcement. And occasionally, someone who was on that original flight will book the same route, same flight number, wanting to relive that moment when a dying man taught them how to live. That's justice, Aaron concluded. Not punishment for wrongs, but meaning wrested from suffering. Captain Richard Hayes didn't get justice in the sense of beating cancer or keeping his medical certificate. But he got something perhaps more valuable, the knowledge that his life's work mattered, that his final act touched thousands, that his ending became other people's beginning. In a world that often feels random and cruel, that's the justice we can create for ourselves and each other. Not fairness, but meaning. Not cure, but purpose. Not avoidance of pain, but transformation of it into something that helps others fly.